Hello and welcome to episode 9 of the Verbal to Visual podcast. I am your host, Doug Neal, and in today's episode, I'm chatting with Evelyn Renders, who works as an information manager at a higher education institution in Europe in connection with study abroad programs where information needs to be passed securely between universities. And her job is to help communicate how that system works, how information is passed, and who needs to do what and when. It's those types of questions that Evelyn wants to be able to communicate clearly with some sort of a visual reference to help. So in this conversation, we talk through what that visual might look like. I think this is a great episode for those using sketchnoting to communicate potentially complex processes across institutions, education or otherwise, and maybe even across cultures. You can find the show notes for today's episode at verbaltovisual.com/9. Let's get into it. All right. Welcome, Evelyn. Thank you for joining us today. To kick things off, I'm going to throw it right to you just to give the listeners a chance for you to let them know who you are, where you're coming from, and generally the work that you're up to and how that kind of ties into sketchnoting.
Yes. Thank you, Doug. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. So I am an information manager working specialized in internationalization, and I'm working at a university in the Netherlands called Radboud University. So we are a higher education institution, and we have a lot of partnerships, international partnerships with other institutions where our students go for short mobility, but our staff also goes there. And I support all the colleagues involved in these processes. So I try to find the ways to translate the user questions and the user concerns with systems into stuff that the technical staff, the IT staff can use to really, make the systems better and work for us. So I'm at the crossover of digitalization, internationalization, and then also a little bit of sustainability, because I think that digitalization can lead to more sustainability in higher education in the long term. That's shortly what I do every day.
Nice. Yeah, well, it's interesting. As you mentioned, kind of that overlap. It gets at a couple of things, which in our kind of correspondence too about what topic we might explore today, there were a couple of potential things that were coming up, and I think maybe each related to on the one side, what I see is as an information manager, like part of your job is to communicate and work with complex technical ideas. So I see that, weaving in well with sketchnoting, visualizing those ideas in some form. But then also the international piece of it as well is another place where sketchnoting can play a role as a kind of cross-cultural communication device. So for kind of like both of those, kind of the complex technical ideas plus the cross-cultural idea sharing, kind of playing in both of those spaces seems interesting to me.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Great. Well, with that as kind of the general background of what you're up to, what do you feel like focusing on for our conversation today?
Yeah, well, so I was thinking, I am working right now on a project which is called Erasmus Without Paper. And Erasmus is a mobility financing structure. It's a program by the European Commission in order to finance mobility of students and staff within Europe, but also outside Europe right now. But the digitalization project, without paper, it kind of says it in the name. They want to digitize all the documents that the students need to handle for their mobility. So what they want to do is they want to get rid of these papers. They want to get rid of the handwritten signatures, of all the scanning and the emailing of private data. So there's also the privacy aspect of it. And they want to put it into a system. But the thing is that systems are kind of complex, and they're a little bit of a black box for people who are not aware of technical specifications and how systems communicate with each other. What happens when you push a button and an email gets sent? How is that structured? So what I'm trying to do is make like a metaphor or a visual story to really explain how does an API work? How does this invisible network of digital structure work? And how do these documents then, which are no longer printed and physical in your hands, how do they get transferred to the right people?
Hmm.
Because I find that there are a lot of questions about this. And this is a project that could, this is a communication that is, I think, relevant for about 5,600 institutions in Europe. So this is also that cross-cultural communication that you just mentioned. There are quite some institutions who are working on this and who need to work on this because it's becoming obligatory in the next years. And I really want to help them communicate this message of digitalization. So I was wondering if you have any tips, or if you've ever experienced having to sketchnote something that is invisible, that is not yet understood. And how did you do that?
Hmm. That's a great question. Uh, Especially the piece around like sketchnoting the invisible. Because there are I think that's a challenge that sketchnoters face in anytime you get into ideas that are more abstract, and I kind of see going in a few directions, like in the direction of technology, like you're talking about, to some degree too, like in the direction of dealing with emotions or things that are less like tangible, less opportunity for kind of a direct sketched object, that you might include for individual ideas. So it's kind of like there's a not quite as strong of a thread, or you as the sketchnoter have to do a little bit more searching, kind of putting your feelers out as you look for the visual metaphors that might be the closest fit to the idea that you're trying to represent. Um, so I feel like a couple of kind of formats are coming to mind. I don't think, I'm trying to think if I've ever worked with anything quite like that before. Um, I don't think so. The first format that came to mind was, depicting a process. I feel like, am I correct in my understanding that much of what you want to be able to communicate is the process by which this information maybe first is digitized, and then also like what happens to it once it is digitized? How is it used from that point on? um, is it mostly process oriented is my first question, and the follow-up, if it is, like, what are the biggest chunks of that process that you want to be able to communicate?
Yeah, so in part it's process oriented, um, but not like, I don't want to visualize the student process, because that's the visualization. I'm thinking about who is my target audience for this message. And
Mhm.
there's a lot of communication being done towards the students about how will you go abroad, and that is done by the higher education institutions, by the universities. They have great websites and workflows and process charts and everything. But what I want to do is I want to target the higher education support staff. So people like me working at the international office of the university who need to actually implement this new digital process. And that's something that takes skills that they most of the times don't yet have, because those are like the 21st century skills that we sometimes talk about, where you know how a computer works, like not like a black box, but really like what's behind it, what's the
Mhm.
system behind it. So I want to focus on that one. And I think that's also the most fleeting. So when you just mentioned visual metaphors, I was also thinking about I have two steps in my head. So at one step, I'm trying to find the right metaphors for these um, kind of complicated topics that I want to explain, like an application programming interface. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. API, or a network node. Those are things that these international officers are now hearing for the first time, and they are expected to actually go into a conversation with their own IT staff about these concepts and make sure that this new process is implemented in their institution, which is a really hard job if you've never heard of these things before. So I really want to give them a story that they could repeat, a story that they could, with
Mm.
some visual markers that they could send to people. So this is how you explain it. Um, that's kind of my goal with this small piece of the project.
Yeah, I like that piece that you mentioned about being able to present a story that they can repeat. Because I feel like that is a nice way to clarify the goal in terms of what you're wanting to communicate to these higher ed support staff in this international office for a given university, just equipping them with that story that they can use as they kind of implement this new system. I feel like that's a great goal. Um,
Yeah, so your question was about the process. So I'm not sure if a process format is the right thing. Perhaps
mhm.
it is, but then it's not about the process of that the students will go through, but it's about the process of digitalization itself. So you have these three steps in digitalization. Some people they make the distinction between digitization, which is just I have a paper here and I scan it and it's now a PDF. That's digitization. So I have it now on my computer as a document. And then you have digitalization, by which we mean you put the information that is in the PDF, you actually put that inside a system, inside a database, where you can, it could be an Excel form or it could be a more complex database where you have the individual pieces of information digitalized. And then you have digital transformation, which is actually then implementing that information that you have into your processes, into your systems, and connecting those systems, and then even making management reports based on this information where you summarize larger quantities of data and you actually see what is happening over time with this data. So those are the three steps, and we are asking right now of these institutions to go into this third step when they've not even started
Hmm.
the first or the second at this point. So there's this fast stream that they have to get into. which I really want to support. Does that make sense? Is that a
It does. No, even just laying out those 3 steps is very helpful. I'm playing around. I mentioned this to Evelyn before we hopped on. For the first time in these conversations, I'm doing some live sketchnoting on a iPad using the app Concepts, just trying to create this real quick rough mind map to track the conversation. I've done rough mind maps within these conversations in the previous episodes, but it's always been on pen and paper, and it gets real sloppy real quickly. So as I mentioned to Evelyn, sometimes I'm like pausing to like finish jotting an idea down or moving things around a little bit. So that's some of what was going on there just now. But yeah, those 3 steps make sense, but I can also see where, like, especially in like the similarity of the names, even just from like digitization to
Mhm.
digitalization to digital transformation. I think I understand the differences between the 3. Um, yeah, I can see how the first 2 steps are important to understand in order to be able to get to that third one. Where do you feel, thinking about the target audience? You mentioned these higher ed support staff. Um, how would you describe, generally speaking, if you're aware, what where their current level of understanding is?
Yeah, that's a good question. It differs a lot, and that's
Mhm.
also
Yeah.
where this cultural locational divide is coming from. So if we look at Europe, you have, of course, big differences between the different higher education institutions in terms of, well, the very easily seeable is, of course, how large is an institution. So do they have hundreds of students who go abroad every year, or do they just have 10? And in both of these cases, they have to digitally transform. See, I'm also struggling with these terms. Digitally transform their processes. And they have different ways of connecting to this new system, which we call EWP, so Erasmus Without Paper. So I think I should perhaps even split up the target group into different levels of understanding, which they have already. Or I could make like a little bit of steps in the story where you begin with the basics, and people who already know the basics, they can go to the next step and the next step until they get more far into the story, but it builds up in a way, so that we don't leave behind the institutions where there is one person who is the whole international office of that university, because that happens a lot. And this person needs to do the financial administration, but also the digitalization, but also the conversations with the students about where do you want to go and what do you want to study. So this is the situation about the target group, which is quite diverse.
Yeah, and potentially having to put on many different hats throughout the day and week.
Yeah.
Um, well, so I think that's a great thing to recognize in terms of your target audience, that their background information does differ widely, and that, it sounds like one of your goals might be to present information in this um, uh, scaffolded or sequenced way in which the person viewing it, probably starts from the beginning still, but can see quickly, like based on the way you've presented that information, if they look at step 1, which is, oriented for kind of laying the basics, they can see that and be like, oh, I already understand that. I can move straight away to step 2. And then maybe they even understand that. And then they can go to step 3 and spend most of their time there. Or if it is someone who is not as familiar with these ideas and the kind of digitization process, that's a hard word to say, no matter
I
what
know.
version of it is. Um, to be able to like hop in at their level and recognize where their level is and build from there. Um, do you feel like so? My first question, as we kind of started going down this rabbit hole, was if there was a process, if it was mostly process oriented, and from there it kind of went. Kind of, but also more story oriented.
Yeah.
Uh, and it seems like it might be a little bit of both, in that the process piece could just be the 3 steps that you mentioned. And what might be a helpful goal is to present each of those 3 steps, like each with its own individual story. Um, and that story could take the shape of like a single page sketch note, maybe that has like a scene as the background and kind of overall format, that addresses each of those steps. So, like the first one could be showing someone just going with that digitize
Digitization.
digitization.
Yeah.
Yeah. Going through that process of, even as you mentioned, like maybe it's just scanning in a document so that they have a PDF version of it up on a screen.
Yeah.
Um, and then so yeah, it's almost like a 3 panel comic, but like instead of each panel with a typical comic, those panels are pretty small. These are kind of like full page scenes so that you can add enough details with some text annotations, to make it as kind of to tailor it to the specific types of information that you're working with and that these staff members need to be familiar with. And then as you move from kind of like one scene to the next, like you can bring some of the visual elements, maybe even like the characters if you have a person representing that staff member. uh, you can bring those visual elements from one scene to the next as you hop over to the next one where it's going from that PDF up on the screen to maybe an Excel document where information is actually being like placed into specific um, pieces of that Excel chart. And then in the next one, it's going from like something that links that Excel chart to uh, some sort of institutional process for. Um,
Yeah.
I don't know what that next piece would look like specifically, but like showing the key actions that occur in each of those stages.
Yeah, I really like that. I'm drawing it right now, so very roughly. But I was as you were saying it, I was drawing it. The first step where you have the guy with the scanner and then you get a PDF, and then the second step you have the online web form where people submit information and that becomes a spreadsheet. And then you have the spreadsheet, which is a part of a larger workflow, which connects to different systems within the university, but then also it connects to the different systems of other universities. And
Mm,
that last part, that is the EWP part. Um,
gotcha.
and I think this would be really helpful because um, it's like the cherry, or how do they say, the cherry on top of the ice cream? Um,
Yeah.
it's the connection bit. It's the last step, and right now it's the thing that we're leading with. But in fact, it's the thing that comes when you have already begun that digital transformation within your institution. And I think right now we're trying to skip a few steps with some institutions, and they're just getting confused. Like, but why? But how? But where does my pen put the signature? That's the question that we get a lot. Um, this would be a great one page, I think, one page explainer with a
Yeah.
story, with a blog post going with it, or perhaps I could make a little like movie of it.
Hmm. Yeah, that sounds great. And I think one of the pieces of information that I see being communicated in a really helpful way is, for the folks receiving this information, those like higher ed support staff, just understanding the way I first phrase it is like what occurs where. Like as this information is being processed, like is this something that happens kind of locally, a step that takes place for each student here in this location, and when does that information become like globally available on this system? uh, yeah, just identifying where the tasks take place, where that information then lives, and the role that the different people and also the different systems, like how those roles interact. That specific piece that you mentioned about, it isn't till kind of like the end of that third step that EWP kind of fits into the picture. So even just being able to communicate that, like, when we talk about this thing, like this is where it lives, and this
Mhm.
is how the previous steps kind of led to it. Um, so I feel like that is a piece that when dealing with technology related things, like a big gap in understanding, I feel like, is just where those different pieces of information live and how they interact
Mhm.
with each other, and who needs to come in at which points to be able to work with that information or add something to it or take some action. Uh, and I
Yeah.
feel like what you're describing helps folks understand their role in those processes.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially that question, where does the information live? I think that's a really good one to answer, because there is this discussion, and it's used as a some kind of scapegoat. It's kind of like the black
Mm.
sheep. If we don't want to talk about something, we say, is it GDPR proof in Europe?
Mm.
I don't know
Mhm.
if you know it, but
Yeah.
it's the Privacy Declaration. I don't even know what it stands for, but it's a privacy law that states that we have to be very careful about what we do with our uh, personal information in systems, and where we store it and why, and how long do we store it, and when do we delete it, and who has access.
Mm.
And this is quite a complex topic, and I think it's really good that we have this law. But it's also misunderstood a lot. And it's also used as a scapegoat when we don't want to have the hard conversation about digital transformation, because we can say, yeah, but it's not GDPR proof. And then the other person thinks, oh, I don't know. Let's just not talk about it.
Yeah. No, I can see that added layer of complexity and compliance, and even just like from my perspective over here in like the US, I remember how big of a deal that was when GDPR came out. And from my perspective, as someone who, runs an online business with an email newsletter,
Yeah.
like the biggest question that I think there's still some like cloudiness around is what's the appropriate way to, you know, request permission for someone's email to be able to send them this newsletter, and also where does like a freebie giveaway come into the mix, and like can I even like require an email for this freebie? Like, even within that very narrow world of kind of like small scale online entrepreneurship, there were a lot of questions. And I feel like the questions just grow exponentially when you're talking about all this, personal information for students as they're studying abroad and moving around and things like that. So I can see the challenge of that piece of it. But I appreciate you mentioning the helpfulness of the question, where does the information live? Which prompted another one for me, and that staff members might be having as well, the question of like, what actions do I need to take? And the that piece of just identifying those big questions, and maybe the one that I just gave isn't like a great second one or additional one, but I could see using those questions to kind of anchor the scenes, the kind of 3-panel process that we're describing. That
Yes.
could be a good way to maybe like introduce those, or uh, thinking about a good starting point for the person taking in this information. Those questions could be a really good starting point when they elicit the response of, yes, that's the exact question that I have. So now I'm really interested in kind of knowing the answer to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that's great.
Yeah, this is a great idea because I think I was kind of looking where I was stuck the last, because I've been thinking about this for, well, a couple of months easily. And I was stuck with where to begin, which is most of the times a place. And I just began with having a lot of conversations. I had conversations with technical staff. I had conversations with very non-technical staff from all over the world. And this is how this story and these questions became more tangible for me. And now I know, okay, I'm going to start with a one page where I just explain these 3 steps in digital transformation, leading up to digital transformation. And then I can build on that, because building on that one page that I have, I can refer to it. I can say, so where does the information live? And then I can say, okay, in this step, it lives there. In this step, it lives there. And then I can connect it to the different terms and terminology that is used within this project, because it's very specific and you have a lot of abbreviations. Of course, you
Hmm.
have EDEC, EWP, IIA. It's You get lost in all the abbreviations. It's a lot of fun. So yeah, and then I can just tackle it question by question, just listening to my colleagues from all over the world and trying to decide, okay, this is the next question that is alive right now.
Mm.
Perhaps it can just be a sequence of LinkedIn posts where I tackle it in blog form, very short information, and then I introduce the vision or the visual component. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like what you're describing is getting to the term that comes up for me, which might not be quite appropriate here, but like the minimum viable product.
Yeah.
Like, what's the first version of this kind of 3-step one pager maybe that you can start to use as you're having conversations with people or sharing these ideas in something like a blog post format or whatever form of communication fits for what you're doing. And then, like, based on the follow-up questions that come, that kind of informs, oh, okay, I need to add this piece of information to this here, or eventually to maybe this other supplementary visual summary of some concept. This would be a good second piece to add in. Through that kind of iterative process, you can continue to make something that just becomes more and more useful, that
Yeah.
answers the typical questions that come up.
Yeah. I have my work cut out for me.
Yeah, you do. That's always a fun place to end it. Maybe and it's a good thing, of course, that we got to like a format that sounds exciting, and that you can kind of see how it might all come together. But that doesn't erase the the next step of actually creating the thing, and sharing it with others. But yeah, getting just the first rough version of it out. I feel like that's something that um, might be a good point to emphasize for you and everyone listening, that even like the roughest sketch that provides some sort of visual reference as you're explaining a concept can go a really long way.
Yeah.
So like this is to you and to the listeners, like don't feel like you have to uh, fit everything into the first version of the diagram that you put together to share an idea with colleagues. Just start with a rough sketch and go from there.
Yeah. Perhaps I can make it I can make a promise. Like, I don't know how long it takes for this podcast to come online, to um go somewhere in the world. But perhaps I can try to have my shitty first draft in before that, and then I can share it in the podcast. How is it called? The text that goes with it.
Yeah, the show notes. I think that's a great idea, because we're probably on pretty close to a month, I would say, between like from recording this conversation to actually publishing it. So yeah, at least 2 to 3 weeks, maybe a month. And I agree. I think that's a good little accountability and motivation to have something together, so that on the blog post, the show notes for this episode, I can share the first version of that.
Great. I'm gonna make sure I have that. I like a little
Yeah,
accountability. It works for me to work under a little bit of pressure. That
yeah. No, I like that too. Um, Great. Well, I feel like we got to a pretty good spot. Do you feel good about your follow-up steps from here, Evelyn?
yes, I sure do. Yeah, and I think at one point I will still need to tackle also the cultural
Mm,
stuff. We didn't really get to that because I think it comes in a later step. Um, but at one point I will, yeah, I don't know, walk into that question.
yeah.
I'll just book another coach call.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, that um, making it cross-culturally accessible
Yeah,
is kind of the next piece, now that you know like the overall structure to it, when it comes down to the details of the visuals that you use, and um, even the language that you use, making sure that that's um, yeah, accessible across cultures is another good question to explore.
yeah.
Great. Well, anything else you'd like to share before we hop off for today, Evelyn?
No, that's it. I like to thank you because I'm really enjoying your. I think it was a year ago that I found your videos on YouTube, and then I found your website and I found your courses, and I was just in time with buying my iPad for your digital
Mm.
sketchnoting course, which we're in right now. And I'm having a lot of fun with the community that you created. So yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you're enjoying it. And I appreciate how much you've been participating too. Anyone who's taking that course will be like, oh, yeah, I know Evelyn. She's been sharing her work a lot, and is joining in on the webinars and all that. So I appreciate how active you've been within that course.
I love to do it.
Great. Well, with that, let's wrap it up for today. Thanks so much, Evelyn, for chatting. Good luck on these next steps, and I'm glad we get to stay in touch and maybe see what you make in response to today's conversation.
Yes, I have a deadline in a month.
You've got it. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. If you'd like to check out the initial form of Evelyn's visual, the one that she put together between recording and then publishing this podcast, then do check out the show notes to see how well what you were imagining in your head matches up with what Evelyn wanted to communicate. And with that, I encourage you to think about what type of information you're sharing. What are the questions that you're answering, and for who? And what form of visual might best suit that question, the response, and that audience. If you'd like to explore the various visual formats that your communication might take, join us within one of our online sketchnoting courses. The course An Introduction to Visual Note-Taking is a great place to start if you're newer to this field, or if you're dipping your toes into the tablet and stylus tool combination, come join us in digital sketchnoting, where you might see Evelyn continuing to share her work. And keep in mind that with the purchase of any of those online courses, you also get access to one-on-one coaching calls like what you just heard at no additional cost. You can find more information about those resources at verbaltovisual.com. Thank you so much for listening this week. I hope it sparked some ideas for you, and I look forward to sharing another conversation with you next week. Until then.